No worries. Okay, so hi everyone. As Dave said, my name is Jay Lessmans. I'm currently acting senior ranger here at the basically for the Diagula area. So my area extends sort of north of the Brisbane River up to the lower end of Sunshine Coast, out to sort of Kilcoy area and back down. So through that area, we manage around about 40,000 hectares of land. It's a mixture of a few different types of tenure as well. Most of the national park. There's some sections within it that are still state forest use, and some locations that are not connected to the main tract of land of the Diagula National Park, like some of the outlying conservation parks, like Sanford, Bunyaville, over at Moggle, near Pullenvale and places like that. A range of land. It's an interesting patch in the sense that it's kind of got all the whole range of interface going on. You know, in our job, we are down this part of the world. We've got that huge expansion going on, which at the moment almost outstrips your ability to plan ahead for it. The rate in which it's coming in on the eastern side and the southern end of the range, it's almost hard to forecast how those changes are actually going to affect park management 3 years down the track, 4 years down the track. Whereas on the western side of the range, predominantly the adjacent land use hasn't changed for 100 years. There's still the graziers out there. We've still got a lot of that sort of rural interface, and you know the existing land processes that have always occurred out there. I suppose just to go briefly into as an overview of some of the main impacts for us in managing these areas and that changing land use on us. A big one for us is fire management. So with our priority is always going to be protection of life and property. We manage our estate that way, and then we also have the environmental values that we take into account. We have a fire strategy for the area that we zone how we're going to treat fire within it, and that identifies kind of like priorities and how we sort of focus our efforts in managing fire and undertaking planned burns, having strategic fire lines and setbacks adjacent to like built up areas, I zones, so those are like high density urban interfaces, and a lot of that stuff gets identified in processes outside of us. So Queensland Fire and Emergency Services have a lot of state-based risk mapping, identifying areas that sit up against us as being like high hazard, where there's like a high density urban development against us. And as that comes in, we have to change the way we manage the estate there. There's a few ways. We try to get in early sometimes and have those sort of conversations with developers during the point where it's construction's happening. Going back even sort of 20, 30 years ago when the whole area was managed as state forest, they did used to have referrals that came across from development applications, and a lot of the time we would make the sort of standard sort of recommendation that there would be like a 25 metre setback of development from the estate boundary, and it was never enforceable though, so it was never a binding recommendation. So this was something that in many instances over the years we've got situations where we've got high density housing right up against bushland, and then we're actually building risk by doing that, and then we have to come in and basically at quite a bit of expense retrospectively implement risk management into that landscape through creating setbacks on the national park estate boundary and that sort of thing. So some of the ways these days, I suppose we're getting a bit smarter about it, is we're trying to get ourselves in there earlier and make the recommendations to developers that they look at doing things like considering the land use adjacent. A lot of them have they have the requirements for X percentage of green space within their own development area. If rather than perhaps putting housing hard up against the national park boundary, it's like maybe we can transition the land use into the national park boundary. Perhaps they need to have sort of treed, open, grassy parkland areas, at which point we would prefer that to be located adjacent to the park, because the management cost of actually going and implementing setbacks afterwards is really, really quite high to reduce those that setup of those high fuel load zones against the park boundary.
So just for anyone who doesn't know, could you just quickly say what a setback is?
So basically just like an area that's to sort of provide a buffer, basically, would be a good way to sort of put it, of development back from the national park estate boundary. It's one that we're trying to also achieve through, like, maybe making recommendations where you get a plan come to you and there's a whole bunch of houses direct against the boundary, and might say to the developer, maybe you could actually align the access to the estate, like the public road, hard against the boundary, and then have some parkland or like a cycleway or something like that that's maintained and mowed, treed overstory, and then you're sort of getting your sort of 25 metres before you're actually hitting direct onto houses. And it's not just the fire side of things, it has an effect on pest management, with these areas. Sometimes there is wild dog presence, and there people have pets in these landscapes. So some of our sort of like peri-urban landscapes, where they have experience issues with that conflict between people keeping pets, keeping chickens in their yard, and being predated upon by predators in the landscape. So setbacks and how people set up their landscape, as well as things like managing just the risk of tree fall. There's a creep when urban development comes in hard on park boundary estate. That we live in Queensland, we have storms every year, and they come through, and the trees are 30 metres tall. They're going to come down. We're going to get 200 km/h winds every year or two. So getting that 25-30 metre setback is also risk management from a perspective of, like, the national park not necessarily having to compromise its values as much on those boundaries to manage risk to construction. If it can be achieved in the planning stage, it's going to be a lot cheaper and a lot more sustainable way to do it ongoing.
Okay.
Yeah.
Sorry, could you repeat how large the area need to be?
It can vary, but generally speaking, we sort of usually sort of push for like a 20 to 30 metre setback. Yeah.
But is that a rule, like a regulation, or is...
Not a regulation, no. There's linkages there in some of the development applications that will come through. They have like a referral process, but they do have to consult with adjacent landholders and that sort of thing. It's not necessarily always binding, but so it's more about trying to find those creative solutions. Certainly, like the bodies that pass off the development approvals can make it binding. So if council wishes to back up that in the process of the development application, they could probably stipulate it to be more binding. And there has been instances where that has occurred. Yeah.
Probably the only hard and fast rule for land development, well, there's a few hard and fast rules, but from a land use point of view, is there is a 25 metre setback from the major creeks.
Yep.
So obviously you can't build over creeks and lakes and things like that. But and you'll see from the GIS data we look at, you can look at the major creeks and you'll see, if you measure from this creek centre to where the back of properties are, you'll see it's about 25 metres. But otherwise, they have to get, some areas have to be approved for development, and that's where these things are taken in that approval process. But they're kind of the nature, they don't like to put a lot of hard and fast rules in terms of regulations. It's more that developers come up with how they're going to develop an area and provide some advantages to an area. But also, they're also trying to, they also have to cite housing, and people, while this is lovely here, you don't really want to build a house here. There's sort of too many trees that can fall on your house, and too much, they could catch fire around here. So so there is a conflict between nature areas and housing. So.
And also from a developer's perspective, so they love to build like new houses, beautiful places to live, but they also want to make money.
Yeah, they're maximising yield.
Yeah,
absolutely.
So, and the reason why perhaps they wouldn't necessarily like the setback idea is because space is money. So the more space they have to build more housing blocks, the more money they're going to make from selling those. So depending on how big the area is, if it borders a lot of the national park and you've got 25 metres along there, that could be quite a significant part of the development area. So That's something also that you're considering in this. So we really need to protect national parks and also the people in it in risk management. But in cases when that doesn't happen, it's probably because of that aspect of development.
Yeah. And that's where we do start trying to work a little bit more creatively in with them in those stages where we are getting referrals. And like I mentioned about, I think sometimes there's perhaps a misconception amongst developers even that we might not want a public road against the park boundary, whereas in many instances we'll actually advocate for that and say, well, that's going to be, if you align your estate and plan it in that way, that's not necessarily going to be a large loss in terms of overall, number of plots, houses that you can sell within that space. You've still got to provide an access road no matter what. We're just sort of telling you to maybe rearrange how you're setting that up and align different uses hard against the boundary. And because that's got benefits as well of not restricting like recreational access to just a few people. If you've got like all private land holdership up against a public resource like state land or something like that, then you've got to start thinking about, with maybe 6,000 people moving into a new development, how they're going to get in and start using this place. They're going to want to use it. They've moved to that area, they know that there's resources there. So we talk to them about that, about the access to the area, and so there'll be times where the developer might come in, and if we can get them to put the public access hard against the boundary, we're achieving a setback, we're getting an appropriate level of fire access in there for even like larger fire equipment like the urban red trucks at the level of access that they need on an asphalt road because they can't go off road, and it's providing they can in their plan as well contribute to some car parking and some formalised entrances to the national park, fund some signage to that tells people what trails and what activities can be done in the area and that sort of thing. So a lot of it is these days is trying to find those creative solutions where we're not getting a conflict in land use, but we're sort of helping them, I suppose, achieve their use of their land, and trying to mitigate the impact that it's going to have on park.
So the development projects, do they have to undergo through an environmental impact assessment at all to be approved?
Yeah,
or not?
Yeah, across the board there's those sorts of things, but obviously for us we're not the assessing body of that.
No.
So as we're simply just one other landholder and a stakeholder.
But they have to include assessment of impact, potential impacts to
Yes.
As
nearby
part of the
areas.
approval, they'll send it to the council.
Yep.
Council will send it to, might send it out to the park people here, they'll send it out to the Environmental Protection Agency, to engineering, transport.
Fire and rescue services will get
But,
one.
yeah, we're not going to get into things at that level of detail here. Any other Nick?
I was just going to add that buffer is purely one of risk analysis, like risk management of fire management and keeping that buffer for people.
Yep.
It's not an environmental buffer. It's not an edge effect mitigation thing. This is entirely, risk management for people. It's not for parks so much, really, is it?
Yeah, but I suppose if you don't do it, then the compromise comes on the park estate.
Yeah, that's
So the impact comes.
Yeah.
We know it does over the subsequent decades of development.
Yeah.
Those really hard boundaries have an impact on how that estate how much it can be managed for its conservation purpose, and how much it has to be compromised for dealing with the risk that's been built into the landscape. Yeah. The other thing economically as well, really, is that it's just development generally, and you touch on that point there about whether it's a risk management and stuff. Parks as a land manager, a lot of our business is managing people. Like we don't. Like land managed itself a long time before parks came along and did and it was fine. Like nature sorts itself out. So we manage interfaces. That's and our resources are concentrated where there is an interface. So it has an impact on the sense of things like funding. The cost of actually managing a state goes up where we have more human interface and a lot more of it. If it's peri-urban or full-blown, sort of urban type stuff. There's a greater public expectation of the sort of access and other things like that, but greater fire management expectations, pest management expectations, and there's more of those conflict sort of issues there between wildlife and or feral pest activity and human activity. So yeah, it's certainly a driver of the cost of managing parks.
Also, for those of you who don't know, the parks are a state government agency. So I guess that also increases the amount of focus on the public and keeping the public safe.
Yep.
So it's like you said, it's not purely focused on the environmental aspects. So there's a lot of effort that goes into making sure like the public can enjoy the parks, but that they're also safe in and surrounding it.
Sure. Yep.
I'll get some more quick, but some of the regional ecosystems, did you want to just talk about, I mean, I know there's, the area we're looking at has some vine thicket.
Yeah.
Now you get that in some of the forest areas, which we'll look at when we go up for a walk near Jolly's, but it's more that wet, whereas I think the area we're looking at is more like sort of a drier, apparently different type of vine thicket that different other birds are attracted to. But I just, maybe if you just set up a little bit about, why the regional ecosystem framework in terms of things, their biodiversity status is also a consideration, probably more outside the park, or just as much outside the park as in.
Yeah, absolutely. Like the regional ecosystem mapping is key to a lot of planning activities. It also drives a lot of the grounds for when we acquire new sections to be added to park, like the regional ecosystem mapping, sort of suggests what values are present, and the listing of them as to whether they are not of concern or whether they're of concern or even more highly rated in priority. So across this area, like you said as well, a lot of I think regional ecosystems that down in the lowland around southeast are probably some of the ones that have been lost the most because of that urban development. The nature of southeast Queensland is you see the largest tracts of conservation land are largely the mountainous areas. So they're the areas that have been basically left following that sort of the European settlement and the change of landscape and the use of it. So you've got that gradual clearing for timber and use of grassy open flats for grazing and for livestock. Predominantly the hills around here, they do have a forestry background, and in the early days they were logged for like red cedar and then a whole bunch of like hoop pine and a whole lot of other hardwood species thereafter until it became a protected area. But these just by the nature of the topography, they are the remnant areas, and a lot of the low-lying sort of grassland, open woodland type stuff, and those creeks with some of that vine thicket is the stuff that's been lost the earliest.
Yep. Any other questions?
Yep.
In the Ellendale website, they talked about they were going to keep 40% of the land for green space. Do you have any say in what 40% that was?
No. We don't. Council would have some.
There was a political process that went on with Ellendale about it being approved as a subdivision by the council, but then the state put up some objections and a few things changed. But to tell you the truth, the fact that Ellendale development's there, we're not really going to consider. I mean, we're trying to. This is a hypothetical exercise, so we want to do a GIS project. So we're just going to treat it as if it's not there. But we're going to come up with. Essentially, I'm going to give you the scenario that the state want to set aside some land for conservation, and they can sort of bring in some rules or something. We won't even get into that side, but some land can be set aside for conservation, and other areas could be allowed to go for development. So it's sort of like this looking towards the future and saying areas that we need to protect and other areas that the development can occur because people need to live. But there's did you want to talk about the biodiversity corridor? You know, there's a going out to the Sanford State Forest.
Yeah. So that's like pretty much the old mountain mangroves corridor out through there. So corridors is a big thing, and you know, to try and provide connectivity, and especially in southeast, there's a lot of interest and pressure on managing koalas in particular and that sort of thing, and providing connectivity through the landscape for the sort of remnant populations that still exist. Corridors are part of the solution. They certainly don't solve the whole issue. Well, I know I've worked in this area for like 14 or 15 years now, so in that time you can see the changes that result in terms of internal presence or abundance of certain wildlife based on the changing landscape around the park. And obviously, you know, the park has to try and have so much robustness about it based on its size and other things like that. But this end of this park, we're starting to get a lot of urbanisation around all sides of it. So I know that over the last sort of 10 or 15 years, the frequency of maybe seeing like macropods like your wallabies and kangaroos and other things, they're less down here now than what they used to be, because they typically would have ranged from the mountain country seasonally and down into like the low-lying areas in different seasons for feed and that sort of thing. So we certainly see a lot more up in the northern end, because there is values off a state, even if it's not national park land. So a lot of time farming country or grazing country next to a park supports conservation values. There's surrounding land uses that you can have that isn't conservation, that is maybe more compatible with supporting landscape conservation. So, you know, a state forest area will support maybe more conservation outcomes than straight up just houses. So as we get development's obviously required, it's needed, and people need a place to live in density and near public transport and all these sorts of things. So then those corridors are basically the solution that's left there to provide that connectivity, and so we're not creating islands in the landscape. You know?
So does anyone not know what a biodiversity corridor is?
What sort of width do they need to be effective?
Good question.
I can give you there is a discussion paper, a review paper on that I can provide, but they go from, you know, they're actually quite wide to it. Well, anything is better than nothing.
Yeah.
But they do sort of set out, you know, like they can be a couple of kilometres, up to 5 kilometres, or even 10 kilometres wide, a major.
And like
I don't think they ever get 10
3 metre
kilometres.
wide corridor is not
Well,
really.
like
I don't think they get 2 kilometres.
The area that David was mentioning through the Sanford there, like there'll be places where the development's already come in, so potentially you've got some areas through there where maybe the corridor is only sort of 300, 500 metres wide, where there's a section of bushland, but then it connects into a conservation park that's 600 hectares in size. So it's just about trying to find that connectivity where it's available.
Yeah. So that northern part, right at the top of your maps here, is Sanford Conservation Park. And so all the areas I've got in yellow, they're potentially, you know, some developable, or we'll treat them as developable areas, but the part to the north of that looks green is Sanford Conservation Park.
I mean, when you
And
say
obviously we're down the south here. This part down the bottom here is where we're in that part of Dagulan National Park.
that Sanford's state forest, though, isn't it? It's not.
No, it's conservation park.
Okay, so it's
Yeah,
part
got
of the
changed.
national park. Oh, good.
Yep.
Okay, well
Just
that's, I think that's, unless...
Oh, I was just going to add that to answer that question of how wide it needs to be, it really depends on the species
Yeah, sure.
and what it is. You know, you need a wider thing if it's a more sensitive species, whereas, you know, certain birds can easily use more narrow corridors. It really depends on the species.
So we're going to workshop through some of those ideas now, just with you in groups in this nice little setting. But I just kind of like everyone to thank Jake for giving us a no, that's great. Thanks a lot. I'll just follow up with an email later on. Okay, great. Okay, great. Thanks a lot.
All right, good luck with your course, everyone.
So first of all, I might as well get people just to stand up and I'll get the conservationists over here and the developers over here. I'm trying to get equal numbers in each group. I'm just letting you, and then I'm going to break you into. We've got about 50 people. maybe groups of 5 or 6 within those 2 divisions. And I want you to just, and so if you're a developer, I want you to brainstorm about some of those areas. And well, I've had to make some cheap boards because we normally run this field trip out to an area where we've got some seminar rooms, but we're doing things a bit more outdoors today. So this is my boards I had to make up yesterday when I realised I didn't have any. So I'm gonna get you to do your groups, just brainstorm some ideas. We only have to spend about 10 to 15 minutes on that. I'll write it on the boards. We're going to refine that later. We'll go up to Jolly's Lookout. We'll have a bit of a look. Again, we're kind of just trying to get a bit of a sense of, well, actually it's kind of a nice place to go to in many respects, but we're just trying to get a sense of some of these values and look at some of these vine thicket areas. And but we'll run another workshop up there and we'll break it down further where I'm actually trying to get you to think about a little bit more about the physical criteria, and we'll kind of process that. But the idea is you're coming up with these ideas about areas that need to be protected and why, how to describe them, and we're going to turn that into GIS layers over the next couple of weeks. And that'll be the GIS project, is to resolve this as an issue and resolve conflicts. Let me think. So just keep in mind that in doing this, this is your project. So if you're coming up with these ideas, we're going to help you out with it, but I'm trying to get the sense that these are your ideas and you're going to develop them into something. The GIS that we'll be doing over the next few weeks, I'll provide just a skeleton version of getting something started, and you can work through, see it. And that's what I'd suggest you do, is just work through the practicals over the next couple of weeks. Get a result out, so you'll see the whole process from beginning to end. It's just a skeleton of a few criteria and a few constraints that we need to consider. But you'll get a result, and then you can kind of add to that. You'll see in the project description, which I'll go through in the lecture and in the practicals, is that if you kind of work through the basics, that's just the basic consideration for the project. But I'm happy for people to get higher marks. Actually, you have to do more extended considerations. So I wouldn't take that on board now. I'd just maybe be thinking about, maybe in the back of your mind, extended considerations are that for one, what we're running is a facilitated process. So if we did have real developers here and real conservation people, we do need to sort of sort out this stuff through a facilitated workshop, which is what we're doing here. So they call that stakeholder analysis. So one of the extended considerations, you could treat this as an example of a stakeholder process. And you could do a little bit of research about what is stakeholder analysis, what is stakeholder processes. It's probably a little bit more academic, and then say how this process fitted in with that. Okay, so that would be an extended consideration. Alternatively, so there's a few ideas for extended consideration. Alternatively, you could take some, well, I haven't given the lecture on remote sensing, but I will have a lecture on remote sensing in a couple of weeks. And I'll provide some remote sensing data over the area, and you could map some of the secondary vegetation, so the regional ecosystems we're talking about there capture the main areas of intact vegetation, and as secondary growth comes up, in other words, it's been cleared at some stage, but now it's started to regrow, that's secondary vegetation, that's not mapped. And you could use, remote sensing would be a great way to do that. So you could do some remote sensing, and that would be, just some very simple interpretation from the imagery that I provide you and map some secondary vegetation. That would be also extended. So you can see or you could come up with something different of your own idea. Okay, so the idea is there's a sort of basic level of doing the practical, which we demonstrate with instructions, but to get, I'm encouraging people, and the higher grades for the assessment are based upon you doing some extended consideration. And it varies from just something a bit more academic on stakeholder analysis to actually doing some GIS. Sort of depends on your own what you like to do. You might want to just do some readings and relate the process, or you might want to just sit in there in the GIS and do some work. I'll give you some suggestions about, but 2 or 3 suggestions for you to do, but quite happy if people come up with something, on their own. Plenty of time to ask questions later, and in the next following weeks we'll be doing this till the end of the semester. So let's get the developers over this side and environmentalists over here. Can I just, so everyone jump up. So first of all, stand up. And environmentalists over here and developers over there. So I'll just say we are going to play, we'll role play the stakeholder groups. When you do the assignment, you're going to have to, you're like the, developers, more developers. I need more developers. I want about half. We are going to, you're going to play a more neutral role in writing up the assignment. But for this part of the stuff, we're just going to role play developers and environment. Now I'm going to get you to break into, I'll let you sort it out. I just want groups of about 5 or 6. And I want you to just sit down there and write down some ideas that you've heard, because this is your assignment. Write down some ideas about what are important criteria that you would see would contribute to protecting land.